What would you do if the frail, penniless woman you sacrificed everything to help suddenly stood up from her wheelchair, revealing herself as a cutthroat billionaire? This isn't a fairy tale. It's a story of brutal manipulation, shattered trust, and a desperate father pushed to the absolute brink. When Rebecca hid her empire to test the heart of a broken man, she never expected her lie would put his little girl in mortal danger. Listen closely, because the truth changes everything. The October rain in Chicago lashed the streets, driven by a bitter wind. Kevin Hayes pulled his worn canvas collar tighter as his steel-toed boots splashed through the South Side puddles. At 34, he looked 10 years older, since his wife, Sarah, died of leukemia 3 years earlier. He had been left with crushing medical debt and a 6-year-old daughter, Emma, who was the only reason he kept going, a master carpenter. Kevin had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift at a construction site. His raw knuckles were wrapped in electrical tape where the bandages had failed. Exhausted, he wanted nothing more than to get home, kiss Emma goodnight, and figure out how to make his last $42 last another 9 days. Then, he heard the sharp, metallic scrape. It was a grating sound, like metal grinding painfully against concrete, followed by a frustrated, breathless gasp. Kevin stopped under the flickering amber glow of a broken street lamp. Half a block down, struggling desperately near the edge of a flooded gutter, was a woman in a wheelchair. Her front right caster wheel was wedged violently into a jagged crack in the sidewalk. The more she shoved at the wet, rusted push rims, the more the chair tilted, dangerously close to tipping her straight into the freezing, filthy water. She looked small, drowned in an oversized, threadbare military surplus jacket. A cheap wool beanie pulled low over her face. Kevin didn't hesitate. He dropped his heavy tool bag, the one containing the livelihood he couldn't afford to lose, and ran toward her. "Hey! Stop pushing! You're going to flip!" Kevin shouted over the drumming rain, sliding to his knees right in the mud beside the chair. The woman flinched violently, raising a pale, trembling hand as if expecting him to strike her. "Don't touch me! I have nothing of value! Leave me alone!" Her voice was sharp, cultured, yet laced with a feral panic. Kevin blinked through the rain, catching a glimpse of her face beneath the soaked wool. High cheekbones, piercing icy blue eyes, and skin that looked entirely too flawless for someone wearing a coat that smelled of mothballs and damp alleyways. "I'm not going to hurt you, lady," Kevin said, his voice dropping into a low, calming baritone. "Your bearing is shattered. If you push again, the fork is going to snap, and you're going face first into this puddle. Let me help." What Kevin didn't know was that the woman glaring down at him was Rebecca Caldwell. Rebecca was 31 years old, unmarried, and the ruthless, undisputed CEO of Caldwell International, a logistics and shipping empire worth just north of $4 billion. She didn't live on the South Side. She owned a 60-story glass monolith downtown, and she didn't need a wheelchair. Her legs worked perfectly fine. Just 6 months earlier, Rebecca survived a devastating SUV crash that left her temporarily paralyzed. During 3 months of recovery in a Swiss clinic, she uncovered the horrifying truth. The crash had been orchestrated by her fiancé and COO, Richard Mercer, who expected her to die so he could seize control of the company while carrying on an affair with her lead corporate counsel. Rebecca returned stronger than ever. She fired Richard, ruined him in court, and purged her executive team. But the betrayal left her deeply distrustful. Even after regaining the ability to walk, she kept it secret, allowing the world to believe she was still confined to a wheelchair. Now, disguised as an ordinary woman, she secretly wandered through the impoverished neighborhoods her company owned, through shell corporations, testing whether genuine kindness still existed among people her board wanted to evict. Every encounter had confirmed her darkest beliefs, until tonight. "I said I don't need your help," Rebecca spat, gripping the wheels. But her disguise had a fatal flaw. The prop wheelchair she had purchased from a thrift store was genuinely falling apart. "Yeah, well, gravity disagrees with you," Kevin said. Without waiting for her permission, Kevin wedged his massive, calloused hands under the steel frame of the chair. He ignored the freezing water soaking through his jeans and the sharp pain in his back. With a guttural grunt, he deadlifted the entire front assembly of the wheelchair, with Rebecca still in it, out of the concrete jaw, and set it gently onto solid pavement. Rebecca stared at him, stunned. Men in her world didn't ruin their clothes for strangers. They calculated ROI. You ruined your pants," she stammered, genuinely thrown off balance by the raw, unhesitating physical effort. Kevin looked down at his mud-caked knees and let out a dry, exhausted chuckle. "They're work pants. It's what they're for. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I can manage from here," Rebecca lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt incredibly vulnerable. Kevin crouched down, pulling a small mag light from his belt to inspect the wheel. "No, you can't. The ball bearings are gone. The housing is cracked. You roll on this for another block. The wheel detaches entirely." "Where do you live?" Rebecca's mind raced. She couldn't give him an address. She didn't actually live here. Her armored Maybach was parked 3 blocks away, waiting with her armed driver. "Around the corner," she lied smoothly. "I'll be fine. I'm a carpenter, but I know my way around metal fab," Kevin said, wiping the rain from his eyes. "My apartment is right across the street. Building 4B. I have a workshop on the balcony. Let me swap out this bolt and stabilize the fork so you can actually get home. It'll take 10 minutes. Rebecca narrowed her eyes, her paranoid instincts flaring. He wants something, she thought. He sees a vulnerable woman and he's going to try to rob me. Or worse. "I am not going to a strange man's apartment," she said coldly. Kevin didn't take offense. He just nodded slowly. "I get it. You're smart not to. But you're stranded. So, here." Kevin reached into his soaked jacket and pulled out his worn leather wallet. He opened it, revealing the pathetic sum of his life savings. 2 $20 bills and 2 singles. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it to her. "My name is Kevin Hayes. Take my ID. Take my phone, too," he said, handing her a cracked, outdated smartphone. "You hold on to them. If you feel unsafe for even a second, you call 911, and you have my name and address to give them. But I am not leaving a disabled woman in an alley in a freezing thunderstorm. My daughter would never forgive me if I raised her to be that kind of man." Rebecca looked at the worn plastic ID, then up at Kevin's earnest, exhausted face. The sheer, terrifying sincerity in his eyes made her breath catch. No one in her billionaire circles looked at anyone like that. There was no angle, no leverage, just raw, bleeding empathy. 10 minutes, Rebecca whispered, tightly gripping his ID. 10 minutes, Kevin promised. The elevator in Building 4B was broken, and Rebecca felt a surge of anger. Caldwell International owned the building through a subsidiary. Yet maintenance reports had claimed the elevators worked. She hated knowing disabled residents were left stranded. But she stayed in character, without complaint. Kevin gripped her wheelchair and carefully carried it up 3 flights of stairs. Sweat soaked his shirt, and every step strained his body. Yet he never let the chair slip or jolt. At apartment 304, he unlocked the door. Warm air, mixed with the scent of powdered cheese and pine cleaner, greeted them. The apartment was tiny, with worn carpet and mismatched thrift store furniture, but it was spotless. "Daddy!" A small missile in pink dinosaur pajamas launched out of the hallway. Kevin caught the little girl, burying his face in her curly brown hair. "Hey, Bug, why are you awake, Mrs. Higgins was supposed to put you down at 8. "I was waiting for you," Emma murmured, rubbing her eyes. Then she stopped, noticing Rebecca sitting in the doorway. Emma's large hazel eyes widened. She didn't see a homeless woman or a broken stranger. She saw a guest. "Hi," Emma whispered, stepping forward. "I like your hat." Rebecca, who regularly made grown men sweat in boardrooms and had politicians on speed dial, found herself entirely disarmed by a 6-year-old. She reached up, self-consciously touching the damp, ugly wool beanie. Thank you. My name is Vicky. I'm Emma. Are you broken?" the child asked innocently, pointing at the chair. Emma. Manners," Kevin chided gently, slipping out of his wet jacket. He paid Mrs. Higgins, the elderly neighbor who had been watching Emma, and locked the door behind her. Vicky's chair had a little accident in the rain. "We're just going to fix it up." Kevin wheeled Rebecca into the small kitchen area, leaving her by a radiator to warm up, while he grabbed his heavy toolbox from the corner. "Do you want some coffee?" Kevin asked, already pouring water into a cheap plastic drip maker. "It's not the fancy stuff, just store brand. But it's hot." "Coffee would be wonderful," Rebecca said, her voice softer now. She watched him work. He knelt by her chair, pulling out wrenches and a small blowtorch. He didn't just fix the broken wheel, he realigned the frame, tightened every loose bolt, and oiled the bearings. He was treating the rusted piece of garbage with the care of a master watchmaker. "So," Kevin said, grunting as he torqued a bolt. "How long have you been in the chair, Vicky?" Rebecca hesitated. Lying suddenly felt like swallowing glass. 6 months. A car accident. That part, at least, was true. I lost my job, lost my fiancé, found myself out here. Kevin paused, looking up at her with a profound, quiet sorrow. "I'm so sorry. The world doesn't play fair, does it?" "No," Rebecca said bitterly. "It doesn't. People only care about what they can extract from you. The moment you're broken, they discard you." "Some people," Kevin corrected gently, going back to the wheel. "But not everyone. You can't let the bad ones make you cold. Vicky, if you do, they win." Rebecca scoffed softly. "That's a very naive way to look at the world." "Kevin, money and power are all that dictate how people treat you." "Maybe in some circles," Kevin said, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag. He poured a mug of black coffee and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. His hands were like rough sandpaper. Hers were perfectly manicured beneath the grime she had rubbed on them. "But I don't have money or power. All I have is my word, my hands, and that little girl in there. When my wife Sarah got sick, the insurance company fought us on every treatment. I drained my savings, sold my truck, went into massive debt, and she still died." Rebecca felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She stared at the black coffee. "I'm sorry. That's awful." "It was," Kevin said, leaning against the counter. "But the people who helped weren't the wealthy hospital board. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, bringing casseroles, and the guys on my framing crew donating their sick days so I could stay with Sarah. The world can be cruel, Vicky, but kindness is still out there if you're willing to see it." Rebecca sipped the bitter coffee. Somehow, it tasted better than the expensive blends she drank in her penthouse. For the next hour, she listened as Kevin shared his dreams of opening a custom furniture shop, a goal buried under medical debt and endless construction work. He also showed her a beautifully carved wooden raven he had made for Emma, revealing a level of craftsmanship that bordered on artistry. When the chair was fixed, sturdier and smoother than when Rebecca had bought it, Kevin insisted on walking her home. "I can't let you push yourself in the dark," Kevin said firmly. Rebecca panicked. "No, please. You've done enough. I have a friend picking me up a few blocks away. Seriously, Kevin, I am safe." She practically begged him to let her go alone, terrified he would discover her Maybach. Finally, Kevin relented. He handed her his heavy, dry flannel coat. "Keep it. You're freezing. I'll get it back from you around the neighborhood." Rebecca rolled out into the hallway. She looked back at the exhausted, bruised man standing in the doorway of his impoverished life, waving at her with a warm smile. When she reached the alley 3 blocks away, her heavily armed security team rushed forward. Her driver, a massive man named Thomas, looked horrified at her muddy state. "Ms. Caldwell, what happened? Are you injured?" Rebecca stood up from the wheelchair. She stripped off the damp military jacket, but she didn't take off Kevin's flannel coat. She pulled it tighter around herself, inhaling the scent of sawdust and cheap soap. "Put the chair in the trunk, Thomas," Rebecca ordered, her voice devoid of its usual icy edge. "And call my assistant, Beatrice. Tell her to wake up. I need a full background check on a man named Kevin Hayes. Every debt, every medical bill, every contract. I want it on my desk by 6 a.m. The Caldwell International Building pierced the Chicago skyline like a jagged shard of black glass. On the 60th floor, Rebecca stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the crawling traffic. She was dressed in a pristine, tailored Tom Ford suit, a stark contrast to the mud-soaked woman from the night before. Her executive assistant, Beatrice, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who knew all of Rebecca's secrets, laid a thick manila folder on the mahogany desk. "Kevin Hayes," Beatrice said softly. "It's a tragedy. Rebecca, he owes over $80,000 in medical debt from his late wife's cancer treatments. His credit is destroyed. He's working 2 manual labor jobs just to keep up with the interest. He's 2 months behind on rent at the Apex Holdings building." Rebecca flinched. Her building. She was the one evicting him. "There's more," Beatrice continued, her tone grave. "His daughter, Emma. She has a congenital heart defect. She requires a specialized surgery that his current insurance won't cover. If she doesn't get it within the next year, the strain on her heart could be fatal. He applied for a business loan to start a custom furniture company to pay for it, but he was denied by 7 different banks because of his debt-to-income ratio." Rebecca turned around, her blue eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying energy. The cynicism that usually shielded her heart had evaporated, replaced by a ruthless, burning desire to tip the scales of justice. "Fix it," Rebecca said. Beatrice blinked. "Excuse me?" I said, fix it. Beatrice, set up a blind trust. Pay off the $80,000 in medical debt anonymously. Route it through a charitable foundation so it doesn't trigger his suspicions or tax liabilities. Second, contact the landlord at Apex Holdings. I want Kevin's rent comped for the next 5 years. Tell the property manager that if Kevin asks, it's a new lottery system for tenants in good standing. Rebecca, you're crossing a line here, Beatrice warned gently. You've done philanthropic work before, but this is incredibly personal. If your board finds out you're using shell companies to manipulate the life of a random carpenter. He is not random, Rebecca snapped, slamming her hand on the desk. He is the only man I have met in my entire life who asked for absolutely nothing when he had all the power. Do it, Beatrice. And one more thing. Create a fake corporate entity, Crestview Developments. Have them offer Kevin an exclusive 6-figure contract for custom woodwork for a new luxury hotel. Pay him a 50% advance up front, today. Over the next 2 weeks, Kevin Hayes' life became a confusing, miraculous blur. It began on a Tuesday when the hospital called to say an anonymous donor had paid Sarah's medical debt in full. The next day, Kevin learned his rent was covered through the building's loyalty lottery. The biggest surprise came when a lawyer from Crestview Developments offered him a $150,000 contract to build custom furniture for a boutique hotel, along with a $75,000 cashier's check as an advance. Kevin quit his construction job that very afternoon. Rebecca couldn't stay away, drawn to his happiness. She continued wearing her thrift store disguise, sitting in her battered wheelchair, and waiting for Kevin at the small park near his apartment every few days. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, Kevin came jogging into the park, his face radiant, carrying a thermos and 2 paper bags. He spotted Rebecca by the duck pond and rushed over. "Vicky!" he called out, his voice booming with a lightness she hadn't heard before. He practically slid into the bench next to her wheelchair. "I brought you a proper sandwich this time. Roast beef, extra provolone, none of that cheap stuff. You seem different." "Kevin," Rebecca said, pretending to adjust her beanie to hide her smile. Vicky, I swear to God, I have an angel looking out for me," Kevin said, opening the thermos to pour her coffee. He excitedly recounted the miracle of the anonymous medical payoff and the massive corporate contract. "I bought the wood today. Vicky, mahogany and ash. I'm building again, real building, and the money. It's enough for Emma's surgery. She's going to be okay. My little girl is going to live." Kevin's voice cracked, and he reached out, grabbing Rebecca's hand. His grip was strong, warm, and trembling. "I told you, Vicky, the world isn't just dark. You just have to hold out for the light." Rebecca looked down at his hand holding hers. A profound, aching guilt began to claw at her throat. She was playing God with this man's life. He thought he was experiencing a miracle, but he was just experiencing the pocket change of a billionaire. She wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to stand up from the chair, strip off the disguise, and tell him she was the one doing this. She wanted to see how he would look at her without the pity. But before she could open her mouth, the hairs on the back of Rebecca's neck stood up. Across the park, exiting a sleek black Lincoln Navigator, was a man in a bespoke gray suit. Rebecca recognized him instantly. It was Marcus Vance. No, wait, not Marcus. It was Julian. No, it was Elias Thorne, Richard Mercer's former head of private security. Richard, her disgraced ex-fiancé, hadn't disappeared into the shadows as she had hoped. He had been quietly tracking her, looking for leverage, looking to prove to the board that Rebecca was mentally unstable and unfit to run the company. And Elias was staring directly at her. "Vicky, you're shaking," Kevin said, noticing her sudden rigid posture. Elias began walking across the grass, his hand resting conspicuously near the bulge under his suit jacket. He had recognized her profile. If Elias exposed her here, in this disguise, Kevin would know everything. Worse, Richard would know she had a weakness, a man she cared about. "I have to go," Rebecca panicked, trying to spin her wheelchair around. "Hey, what's wrong?" Kevin asked. Standing up, he followed her gaze and saw Elias marching toward them, looking every bit like a corporate hitman. Kevin's protective instincts, honed by years of defending his daughter in rough neighborhoods, flared instantly. "Rebecca Caldwell!" Elias called out, his voice dripping with venomous amusement. "Your ex sends his regards. Time to end this little poverty cosplay." Kevin froze. "Rebecca." Before Elias could reach the wheelchair, Kevin stepped directly into his path, squaring his broad, muscular shoulders, creating an impenetrable wall of denim and muscle between the suited man and the woman in the wheelchair. "I don't know who you think she is, pal," Kevin growled, his voice dropping into a lethal, protective register. "But her name is Vicky, and you need to take 3 steps back before I break your jaw," Elias sneered, reaching inside his jacket. "Step aside, carpenter. This doesn't concern you." Kevin didn't hesitate. He lunged. Kevin didn't fight like a man who spent time in martial arts dojos. He fought like a father who had spent 3 years defending his little girl in neighborhoods where the police took 30 minutes to respond. He lunged with raw, explosive power, driving his shoulder directly into the suited man's chest. The man, a ruthless corporate fixer named Preston Blake, on Richard Mercer's payroll, gasped as the breath was driven from his lungs. The 2 men crashed onto the damp grass. Kevin's heavy carpenter's frame easily outmatched Preston's tailored agility. But Preston was trained for dirty combat. As Kevin raised a calloused fist, Preston drove a knee sharply into Kevin's ribs, followed by a vicious strike to the side of Kevin's head, with a heavy steel tactical pen he'd slipped from his pocket. Kevin grunted, his vision flashing white, but he refused to back down. He grabbed Preston's wrist, twisting it until the man snarled in pain. "Get away from her," Kevin roared, pinning Preston's arm against the muddy earth. Rebecca was paralyzed, not in her legs, but in her mind. She watched the brutal struggle, terror gripping her chest. She had built a fortress of wealth and security around herself, yet here was a man who owned nothing, bleeding into the grass to protect a broken woman he barely knew. Preston, realizing he was losing the physical grapple, reached with his free hand for the holster at his hip. The unmistakable black grip of a compact firearm cleared his jacket. "Kevin, look out!" Rebecca screamed. Rebecca didn't think. Pure instinct shattered months of deception. She kicked away the wheelchair's footrests, planted her designer boots on the pavement, and sprang to her feet, grabbing Kevin's heavy thermos. She swung it with all her strength. The stainless steel slammed into Preston's head, knocking the weapon from his hand. Kevin reacted instantly, driving a crushing right hook that sent the fixer unconscious. Breathing hard, blood running from a cut above his eye, Kevin kicked the gun out of reach before turning to Rebecca, his only concern making sure she was safe. His eyes locked onto her. She wasn't in the wheelchair. Rebecca was standing upright, her posture perfect, her legs bearing her weight without a trace of a hesitation or tremor. The oversized wool coat hung loosely over a frame that suddenly commanded immense authority. The cheap beanie had been knocked off in the fray, revealing impeccably styled, expensive chestnut hair. The silence that fell between them was heavier than the storm from the night they met. "Vicky," Kevin breathed, his voice trembling as he wiped blood from his brow. You're standing." Rebecca took a half step toward him, her hands raised defensively. "Kevin, please, let me explain." The pieces began falling into place in Kevin's mind. The cultured voice she tried to hide, the way she hadn't touched the community clinic pamphlets he'd given her. And then, the words Preston had shouted before the fight. Rebecca Caldwell, poverty cosplay. "He called you Rebecca Caldwell," Kevin said, the color draining from his face. "Caldwell International, the shipping company. I used to frame warehouses for your subsidiaries." He looked at the rusted wheelchair, then back to her flawless stance. "You're not homeless, you're not broke, and you're not paralyzed." "I was," Rebecca pleaded, tears springing to her eyes. "After a car accident, I was in a chair for months. Kevin. But I recovered. I kept it a secret. From my board, from everyone. People were trying to destroy me. So you came down to the south side in a fake broken wheelchair." Kevin's voice cracked, a devastating mix of anger and profound betrayal washing over him. "To do what? Play tourist in my misery, watch the poor people struggle." "No, it wasn't like that," Rebecca insisted, taking another step. "I was broken, Kevin, inside. I didn't trust anyone. I wanted to see if there was a single decent human being left in this world who wouldn't try to use me. And then I found you." Kevin backed away, staring at her as if she were a ghost. "The medical bills, the anonymous donor who paid off Sarah's hospital debt." Rebecca looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "Yes. The rent lottery at the building. Apex Holdings is one of my subsidiaries," she whispered. Kevin felt the world tilt on its axis. The pride he had felt just an hour ago, the belief that his hard work and a stroke of divine luck were saving his daughter, turned to ash in his mouth. Crestview Developments, the boutique hotel contract. Was any of it real? Rebecca, was any of it my actual work? "Your work is brilliant, Kevin, I swear it," Rebecca said desperately. "I just sped up the process. I gave you the capital you deserved. You were drowning, and I had the power to pull you out. I did it because I care about you. I did it because of Emma." "Don't you dare say my daughter's name," Kevin snarled, a fierce, terrifying anger finally breaking through his shock. "I invited you into my home. I introduced you to my child. I gave you the last $20 I had to my name, and you took it, knowing you had billions in the bank. You turned my entire life into a charity project to make yourself feel better." "Kevin, please," Rebecca begged, reaching for him. Kevin recoiled, picking up his bloody flannel coat from the bench. "I earned everything I ever had. Even the failures were mine. But you took that away from me. You made me a puppet." He pointed a shaking finger at the unconscious Preston. "And you brought this danger near my kid. Keep your money, Miss Caldwell, and stay the hell away from us." Kevin turned and walked away, limping slightly, leaving Rebecca standing alone next to an empty wheelchair as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. The climate-controlled air of the Caldwell International boardroom was suffocating. Rebecca sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, her demeanor cold, calculated, and completely devoid of the vulnerability she had shown in the park. She wore a sharp, charcoal pinstripe suit, her blue eyes scanning the 12 board members seated around her. It had been 4 days since Kevin walked away. 4 days of agonizing silence. She had tried to call him, tried to send Beatrice to his apartment, but Kevin had refused to engage. He had mailed back the $75,000 cashier's check torn into tiny pieces inside an envelope. But Rebecca couldn't focus on her heartbreak today. She was fighting for her life. At the opposite end of the table stood Richard Mercer. Her ex-fiancé looked devastatingly smug, adjusting his silk tie as he projected a series of documents onto the glass smart screen behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Richard said smoothly, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "I asked for this emergency session because the stability of this $4 billion enterprise is in grave jeopardy. We have all witnessed Miss Caldwell's erratic behavior since her unfortunate accident. We accommodated her remote leadership while she claimed to be wheelchair-bound. But I have uncovered evidence of severe financial mismanagement and deeply concerning psychological instability." Rebecca didn't blink. "Tread very carefully, Richard." Richard smirked. He pressed a button on his remote. A video began to play. It was drone surveillance footage, clearly shot by Preston Blake before the altercation in the park. It showed Rebecca, dressed in her tattered military coat and beanie, sitting in a busted wheelchair, laughing with a man in flannel. Murmurs erupted around the table. The board members exchanged alarmed glances. This is our CEO, Richard sneered. Sneaking into the slums of the South Side, pretending to be a destitute, paralyzed vagrant. But that's not the worst of it. He clicked the remote again. Banking ledgers appeared. Through unauthorized blind trusts and shell companies, namely Crestview Developments, Ms. Caldwell has embezzled nearly $300,000 of corporate funds to personally finance the debts of the man in this video, a carpenter named Kevin Hayes. She has used Caldwell International Resources to play fairy godmother to her street-level obsession. It wasn't embezzlement, Rebecca snapped, standing up, placing her palms flat on the table. The funds were drawn from my personal equity accounts, routed through corporate channels merely for anonymity. Every cent is accounted for. And the rent waivers for an entire building block, Richard countered. Apex Holdings is reporting losses because you unilaterally ordered a rent freeze for Mr. Hayes and his neighbors. You are bleeding our subsidiaries dry to fund your delusions. I am showing humanity to the people we step on, to make our margins, Rebecca fired back, her voice echoing with a passion that shocked the room. We own blocks of residential real estate. We let them rot, and we evict the working class when they fall behind because of medical debt. I paid his debts with my own money. If you have an issue with the accounting, I will write a personal check to the board right now. It's not about the money, Rebecca, said Harrison Ford, the eldest board member, looking deeply troubled. It's about judgment. You lied to us about your physical condition. You are engaging in bizarre, risky behavior in dangerous neighborhoods. You assaulted a private investigator. He was an armed thug. Harrison, Rebecca shouted. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders, Richard interrupted smoothly, smelling blood in the water. The bylaws are clear. Under Section 4, a CEO can be temporarily suspended without pay if their actions pose an immediate reputational or financial threat to the company, pending a full psychiatric and legal review. Rebecca looked around the table. She saw the averted eyes, the nervous shifting. Richard had poisoned the well. He had spent the last 6 months currying favor with these men and women while she was distracted by her own paranoia and, eventually, by Kevin. You're going to let him do this? Rebecca asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He sabotaged my car. He tried to kill me. Those are baseless, paranoid accusations. Rebecca, Richard sighed, playing the part of a concerned friend perfectly. We all want you to get the help you need. Harrison cleared his throat. I motion for a vote of no confidence and the immediate, temporary suspension of Rebecca Caldwell as CEO, transferring interim authority to the Chief Operating Officer, Richard Mercer. The vote was swift. 8-4. Rebecca stood perfectly still as the reality washed over her. She had built this empire. She had tripled its valuation in 5 years. And in less than 10 minutes, it was stripped from her. Security will escort you to the lobby. Rebecca, Richard said, a triumphant, sickening smile playing on his lips. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your access badges are deactivated. Please, take some time to rest. Rebecca gathered her blazer. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She looked dead into Richard's eyes. You think you've won, Richard, Rebecca said, her voice like crushed ice. But you've just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. You backed me into a corner. Now you get to see what I do when I have nothing left to lose." She walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to a war. Kevin Hayes stood in the center of his small living room, staring at the flashing red light on his answering machine. The rain had returned to Chicago, beating against the thin glass of his window, mirroring the relentless pounding in his head. The past week had been a nightmare of whiplash. The euphoria of financial freedom had been brutally ripped away, replaced by a deep, hollow humiliation. He had torn up the check. He had told the property manager he was paying his back rent, not accepting the lottery. He was a man of fierce pride, and he refused to be a billionaire's pet project. But pride didn't pay for pediatric cardiology. The phone rang. Kevin snatched it up. "Hello? Mr. Hayes. This is Dr. Gallagher's office at Chicago Presbyterian," a curt, professional voice said. Kevin's heart leapt. Yes, I've been waiting for your call. Were you able to schedule Emma's surgery now that the old debt is cleared?" There was a heavy pause on the line. "Mr. Hayes, I'm afraid there's been a complication. The anonymous trust that cleared your late wife's medical debt has placed a stop payment on the transfer. The hospital's accounting department was just notified that the funds are under investigation for corporate fraud." Kevin felt all the air leave the room. "What? No, that can't be right. The debt was zeroed out. You sent me a letter. The funds have been recalled by the issuing bank, sir. Furthermore, because your account is once again flagged as severely delinquent, the hospital administration cannot authorize Emma's elective surgery. She has been removed from the surgical schedule." "It's not elective!" Kevin shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "It's a congenital defect. Her heart is struggling. You can't take her off the list." I'm deeply sorry, Mr. Hayes. Until the $80,000 balance is settled, our hands are tied. Good luck." The line went dead. Kevin dropped the phone, his hands shaking violently. He turned and looked down the hallway. Emma was sitting on the floor of her bedroom, quietly playing with the wooden raven he had carved for her. She looked tired. She was always so tired lately. The rage that boiled up inside Kevin was blinding. He assumed Rebecca was throwing a tantrum. He had rejected her money, so she was punishing him. She was using her immense power to crush him, just like all the other wealthy vultures he had dealt with. He threw on his jacket, ready to march downtown to the Caldwell building and tear the lobby apart until she faced him. But before he could reach the doorknob, a frantic, heavy knocking rattled the cheap wood of his front door. Kevin yanked the door open, his fists clenched. Standing in the hallway was Rebecca, but she looked nothing like the polished CEO he had seen in the park, nor the ragged woman from the alley. She wore a simple trench coat over jeans. Her hair was messy, her eyes wide and bloodshot from lack of sleep. Standing behind her was a severe-looking older woman, Beatrice. "Kevin, you have to pack a bag for you and Emma right now," Rebecca said, her voice breathless and urgent, pushing her way into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "Get out of my house," Kevin growled, stepping into her path. "You've done enough. You canceled the debt payoff. You took my daughter off the surgery list because your feelings got hurt." Rebecca froze, her face dropping in horror. "What? No! Kevin, I didn't do that." "The hospital just called. The funds were flagged for fraud," Kevin yelled, no longer caring about keeping his voice down. "It's Richard," Beatrice interjected, stepping forward. She looked out the window, scanning the street below. Rebecca was ousted from her company yesterday in a hostile boardroom coup. Her ex-fiancé, Richard Mercer, has taken control of Caldwell International. He froze all of Rebecca's assets and flagged the trusts she set up for you. Kevin blinked, the red haze of anger slowly parting. Ousted? Why? Because of me, Rebecca said softly, the guilt heavy in her eyes. He used surveillance footage of us in the park. He used the money I spent on your debts and the rent waivers to paint me as mentally unfit and financially reckless. I lost my company, Kevin. Kevin stared at her. You threw away $1 billion company for me. I don't care about the company right now, Rebecca said, grabbing his arm. Her grip was strong, desperate. Richard isn't just going to stop at taking my title. He is deeply paranoid. He knows you are the reason I was distracted. He knows I care about you. If he's pulling the hospital funding, it means he's actively targeting you to punish me. He's an executive. Rebecca. What's he going to do? Send me a meanly worded letter? Kevin scoffed, though unease was settling in his stomach. You met Preston Blake in the park, Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly serious register. Preston is not HR. He's a fixer, and Richard just gave him unlimited access to the company's black book funds 10 minutes ago. Beatrice intercepted an email on a secure server before her access was revoked. Preston isn't just trying to ruin your credit. Kevin, he's coming here to make sure you and I don't become a problem for the upcoming shareholder vote. Right on cue. The sound of squealing tires echoed from the street below. Kevin rushed to the window, pulling the blinds back a fraction of an inch. Down on the rain-slicked street, 2 black, unmarked SUVs had aggressively jumped the curb, blocking the front entrance of Building 4B. 4 men in dark tactical gear stepped out into the rain. Preston Blake was leading them, a heavy crowbar resting casually on his shoulder. They're here, Kevin whispered, the blood turning to ice in his veins. He turned back to Rebecca, his protective instincts completely overriding his wounded pride. He didn't see a billionaire who had lied to him. He saw a woman who had sacrificed her entire empire to help his family, and who was now in mortal danger because of it. Beatrice, go to Emma's room. Keep her quiet. Kevin barked, slipping immediately into survival mode. He walked over to his heavy wooden workbench in the corner of the living room and reached underneath, pulling out a heavy, steel-framing hammer. Kevin, we can't fight 4 of them, Rebecca said, her heart hammering in her chest. We aren't going to, Kevin said, his eyes hard and focused. Building 4B has a fire escape, but it rusted through 3 years ago. The landlord never fixed it. The only way down is through the basement utility tunnels. Apex Holdings owns the building next door, right? Yes, Rebecca nodded. Good, because I have the master keys to the basement grates, Kevin said, tossing her a heavy metal flashlight. You wanted to know how the working class lives. Vicky, time to run. Outside apartment 304, heavy tactical boots thundered up the stairs. Preston Blake and his men weren't trying to be quiet. They had the building surrounded and knew their targets were trapped on the 3rd floor. Inside, Kevin moved with calm urgency. He wrapped the frightened Emma in his work jacket, then pointed Beatrice toward a narrow pantry door. The building superintendent was a friend, Kevin whispered, pulling out a ring of old brass keys. He showed me the abandoned coal chutes. They connect to utility tunnels beneath the block. Apex Holdings was supposed to seal them years ago, but they pocketed the renovation money instead. Rebecca felt a sharp pang of corporate guilt, but she pushed it down. She grabbed the metal flashlight Kevin had tossed her and followed Beatrice into the dark pantry. Kevin kicked away a false floorboard, revealing a rusted iron grate. He jammed a key into the heavy padlock, twisting it until it snapped open with a harsh click. Below them lay a vertical shaft dropping into absolute darkness, smelling of damp earth, mildew, and decades of rot. I'll go first. Pass Emma down to me, Kevin instructed. He lowered himself into the abyss, his boots finding the ancient iron rungs of a ladder. Above them, the front door of apartment 304 exploded inward with a deafening crash. Splinters of cheap pine rained across the living room carpet. "Go! Go!" Kevin hissed. Rebecca grabbed Emma, her heart pounding against her ribs, and lowered the trembling 6-year-old into her father's waiting arms. Beatrice went next, scrambling down the ladder with surprising agility. Rebecca was the last to descend, just as she pulled the heavy iron grate closed above her head. The pantry door swung open. The beam of a tactical flashlight swept over the floorboards, missing the concealed grate by mere inches. Rebecca held her breath in the suffocating darkness, clinging to the rusted ladder, listening to Preston's muffled voice, barking orders directly above her head. "They're not here. Check the fire escapes. Tear the drywall out if you have to." Slowly, agonizingly, the group descended into the subterranean belly of the city. The tunnels were a freezing maze of stagnant water, crumbling brick, and rusted steam pipes. Kevin led the way with Emma in his arms to keep her above the water, while Rebecca followed with a flashlight. "Daddy, my chest hurts," Emma whispered, her breathing growing fast and shallow. Kevin stopped, his face tight with fear. The cold and stress were overwhelming her fragile heart. "I know. Bug, we're almost there. Stay with me. Breathe slowly. Count with me." Watching him comfort his daughter, Rebecca realized Richard had deliberately endangered a sick child just to hurt Kevin. Her anger hardened into absolute resolve. She was done running. At last, they reached a steel door. Kevin forced it open, and they climbed into the abandoned basement of the neighboring building, collapsing onto the dry concrete, struggling to catch their breath. "We need to get to a hospital," Kevin said frantically, feeling Emma's forehead. She was clammy and pale. "I have a friend with a truck 3 blocks from here. We can get her to St. Jude's." "Kevin, St. Jude's won't touch her surgery without the upfront capital," Beatrice said gently, wringing the filthy water from her skirt. "Richard flagged you in the National Registry for medical debt fraud. Any private hospital will turn you away until the investigation clears, which Richard will drag out for months." Kevin slammed his fist against the concrete wall, tears of pure rage springing to his eyes. "So what do we do? Just let her die, because some billionaire suit threw a tantrum?" "No," Rebecca said, her voice echoing in the hollow basement. It wasn't the voice of the broken woman in the wheelchair. It was the voice of a CEO who commanded empires. Kevin looked up, startled by the sheer authority radiating from her. "Richard thinks he has won because he holds the bank accounts," Rebecca continued, stepping forward. "But Beatrice didn't leave the building empty-handed yesterday. Did you?" Beatrice permitted herself a grim, razor-thin smile. She reached into her soaked blazer and pulled out a small, waterproof silver drive. "Before my credentials were revoked, I triggered a shadow protocol on the executive servers. I downloaded the offshore ledgers. Richard hasn't just been embezzling. He's been using Caldwell shipping containers to smuggle untaxed lithium for a private military contractor in Dubai. It's federal treason." Kevin stared at the drive. "So give it to the police! Give it to the FBI! We can't!" Rebecca said bitterly. "The drive is encrypted with military-grade biometrics. It requires a physical decryption key to unlock the data. Without the key, it's just a piece of metal, and no federal judge will issue a warrant against a $4 billion company based on the word of a mentally unstable, recently ousted CEO." "Where is the key?" Kevin asked, his voice low. Rebecca looked him dead in the eye. "It's in a biometric safe, behind a reinforced steel panel, on the 60th floor of the Caldwell International building. In my former office, which Richard is currently occupying. Kevin let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. You want to break into a heavily guarded corporate skyscraper. Tonight. I don't want to. Kevin. We have to, Rebecca said, dropping to her knees so she was at eye level with him. She reached out, gently touching his bruised cheek. Richard has Preston out hunting us. We can't run forever. If we get the decryption key, I can expose him to the feds by morning. I get my company back. I unfreeze the trusts. Emma gets her surgery tomorrow. It is the only way. Kevin looked at Emma, who was leaning against Beatrice, her breathing still labored. He looked at his calloused, battered hands. He was a carpenter, a man who built things. He had never destroyed anything in his life. The Caldwell building, Kevin muttered, his eyes narrowing as his mind began to race. The 60th floor. You renovated the executive suites 3 years ago, right? Rebecca blinked. Yes. How did you know that? Because, Kevin said, a dangerous, calculating spark igniting in his eyes. I was the foreman on the framing crew that built the HVAC routing for the 58th and 59th floors. I know the blueprints. I know the blind spots in the service shafts that the security cameras don't cover. And I know exactly how to bypass the electronic locks on the maintenance elevators, using nothing but a voltage meter and a crowbar. Rebecca stared at him, a sudden, fierce hope surging in her chest. Together, they were a perfect weapon. She knew the software. He knew the bones of the building. Are you in? Rebecca asked. Kevin stood up, pulling his heavy framing hammer from his belt. Let's go steal your company back. The storm outside had escalated into a torrential downpour by the time Kevin's friend dropped them off in a dark alley, 2 blocks from the Caldwell International Tower. Beatrice had taken Emma to a safe house, a quiet motel on the edge of the city, paid for in untraceable cash. Kevin had promised his daughter he would be back by sunrise. He couldn't afford to break that promise. The Caldwell building was a fortress of glass and steel, guarded by a state-of-the-art security system and a small army of private guards on Richard's payroll. The main lobby is impossible, Rebecca whispered, peering around the edge of a brick dumpster enclosure. Facial recognition cameras, RFID turnstiles, and at least 4 armed guards. We aren't using the lobby, Kevin replied, hoisting his heavy tool bag over his shoulder. He led Rebecca to a grate covering a subterranean exhaust vent in the alleyway. Using a heavy pry bar, Kevin snapped the industrial bolts as if they were made of plastic. They slipped inside, dropping into a narrow, deafeningly loud mechanical room filled with massive humming generators. The security system is heavily digitized, Kevin shouted over the noise, leading her through a maze of pipes. But buildings this size always have a physical fail-safe for fire marshals. The freight elevator at the core of the building bypasses the digital network. It runs on an analog relay. They reached the heavy steel doors of the freight elevator. There was a keypad, glowing an angry red. Rebecca reached for it, but Kevin caught her wrist. Don't touch it. It'll log your biometric signature, he warned. Instead, Kevin pulled a cordless drill and a specialized titanium bit from his bag. With surgical precision, he drilled a small hole straight through the steel panel beside the keypad. He fished a hooked piece of copper wire into the hole, blindly feeling for the internal relay switch. A tense minute passed. Sweat dripped down Kevin's face. Click. The heavy doors groaned and slid open. Rebecca looked at Kevin in absolute awe. Where did a carpenter learn to do that? When you work on sites where contractors try to stiff you on your paycheck by locking up your tools, you learn how to get your tools back, Kevin said grimly. They stepped into the elevator. Kevin bypassed the floor selector entirely, popping open the control panel and manually crossing the heavy-gauge wires to send the cab shooting upward. The ride to the 60th floor was agonizingly slow. The tension in the small metal box was thick enough to choke on. Rebecca looked at Kevin. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white around the handle of his hammer. "Kevin," Rebecca said softly over the hum of the elevator, "I never apologized properly for lying to you." Kevin didn't look at her. "You don't need to apologize for wanting to survive. Rebecca, you were betrayed by someone you loved. You built a wall. I get it. But I dragged you behind that wall," she said, stepping closer to him. "You were right in the park. I was playing God. I thought money could fix the world, but it almost destroyed yours. When I saw you fight for me today, I realized you're the richest man I've ever met, and I am so deeply sorry." Kevin finally turned his head. The anger that had burned in him was gone, replaced by a profound mutual understanding. "Let's just get the key. Vicky, we can figure out the rest if we survive the night." The elevator jolted to a halt. Floor 60. Kevin pried the doors open a fraction of an inch. The executive hallway was dimly lit, the plush carpets absorbing the sound of the storm outside. Rebecca pointed down the hall. "My office is at the end. The safe is behind the oil painting on the left wall," she whispered. They slipped out of the elevator, moving like shadows. They reached the massive mahogany doors of the CEO's office. Rebecca pressed her thumb to the scanner. The light flashed green. Richard hadn't bothered to wipe her biometrics from her own office yet, arrogant in his assumption that she would never get past the lobby. The office was vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in jagged bursts of white. Rebecca rushed to the left wall, pulling down a heavy oil painting of a maritime ship. Behind it was a sleek, digital safe. She rapidly punched in a 12-digit code, then placed her palm on the glass scanner. Beep. Whir. The safe clicked open. Inside, resting on a velvet pad, was a small, heavy platinum USB key. "Got it," Rebecca breathed, snatching the key and turning to Kevin with a victorious smile. "I have it. We can go." "Oh, I'm afraid you're not going anywhere, Rebecca." The voice came from the shadows behind the massive executive desk. The lights in the office suddenly blazed to life, blinding them. Sitting in the high-backed leather chair, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand, was Richard Mercer. He didn't look surprised. He looked utterly delighted. From the two side doors of the office, Preston Blake and 3 heavily armed security contractors stepped into the room, raising suppressed tactical pistols, aiming them directly at Kevin's chest. "You really think I wouldn't monitor the analog relays on the freight elevator?" Richard chuckled, standing up and taking a sip of his scotch. "I've been tracking your ascent since floor 12. It gave me just enough time to pour a drink and enjoy the view." Kevin stepped in front of Rebecca, shielding her with his body, his grip tightening on his hammer. "Put the tool down, Bob the Builder," Preston sneered, a nasty bruise purple across his jaw where Kevin had hit him in the park. "Or I put a bullet in your spine and let you see what a real wheelchair feels like. Hand over the drive and the key." "Rebecca," Richard ordered, his smile vanishing, replaced by a cold, reptilian glare. "And maybe I won't have my men dump your carpenter friend in the river." Rebecca clutched the decryption key, her heart plummeting into her stomach. They had walked right into a trap. The silence in the opulent office was deafening, broken only by the rain lashing against the reinforced glass. 5 guns were pointed at Kevin. There was no way out, no hidden tunnel, no structural weakness to exploit. "Give it to him, Rebecca," Kevin said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't drop his hammer, but he kept his hands steady. Emma needs you alive to unfreeze the trust. That's all that matters. How touching, Richard mocked, walking slowly around the desk. The peasant sacrifices himself for the queen. But you see, Kevin, Rebecca isn't going to unfreeze anything. Because tonight, the tragic, mentally unstable former CEO of Caldwell International is going to leap from this very window in a fit of despair. And you, the obsessed stalker who broke in here to harm her, will be shot by my heroic security team. Rebecca felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. Richard wasn't just going to take the company. He was going to execute them both and frame Kevin for her murder. "You're a monster, Richard," Rebecca spat. "I'm a businessman," Richard corrected. "Now, the key. Toss it on the desk." Rebecca looked at Kevin. He gave her a microscopic nod. A silent communication forged in the fires of the last 24 hours. "Trust me." Rebecca raised her hand, holding the platinum key between her fingers. She didn't toss it on the desk. With a sudden, violent flick of her wrist, she hurled the heavy metal key as hard as she could toward the massive floor-to-ceiling window behind Richard. The key struck the reinforced glass with a sharp clack and bounced, falling into the metal grating of the floor-level heating vent. It slipped through the slats, disappearing into the ductwork. Richard screamed in fury. "You stupid bitch! Preston, get that vent open!" For a fraction of a second, the guns wavered as Preston and the guards looked toward the window. That was all Kevin needed. He didn't swing the hammer at the armed men. He spun around, swinging the heavy steel claw of the framing hammer with devastating force directly into the office's main electrical breaker panel, set into the wall beside the door. Sparks showered the room in a blinding explosion of white light. The 60-story building's localized grid short-circuited violently. The lights blew out, plunging the office into pitch-black darkness. "Shoot him!" Richard shrieked in the dark. Gunfire erupted, the suppressed pops hissing through the air, shattering the glass of the desk and shredding the leather chairs. But Kevin was already moving. He tackled Rebecca to the floor, rolling them behind the heavy, bulletproof mahogany of the CEO's desk. "The key!" Rebecca whispered in the dark, panicked. "It's gone." "No, it isn't." Kevin breathed, pulling her close. "I framed these ducts. Remember? That vent doesn't drop down. It's a horizontal return. The key is sitting 2 feet inside the pipe." Before Rebecca could process this, a massive, echoing boom shook the entire floor. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of the heavy mahogany office doors being blown completely off their hinges. Flashlights cut through the smoke and darkness. "FBI, drop your weapons! Drop them now!" The room was suddenly flooded with federal agents in heavy tactical gear. Assault rifles trained on Preston and his men. The private contractors, realizing they were vastly outgunned by the federal government, instantly dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Richard stood frozen, the color completely drained from his face, his Scotch glass shattering on the floor. Rebecca peeked out from behind the desk. Walking through the smoke, flanked by FBI agents, was Beatrice. And beside her was Harrison Ford, the elder board member who had led the vote to oust Rebecca. "Beatrice!" Rebecca gasped, Kevin helping her to her feet. Beatrice adjusted her glasses, looking thoroughly unbothered by the chaos. "I apologize for the delay, Rebecca. But you see, I didn't just take the encrypted drive when I left. I also sent a small, unencrypted sample of Richard's treasonous communications directly to Harrison and the FBI Cybercrimes Division. It seems the board isn't too keen on funding international terrorism." Harrison stepped forward, looking at Richard with absolute disgust. "You lied to us!" Richard, you used the board to stage a coup to cover your tracks. You're finished. Agents grabbed Richard, slamming him against the wall and clicking heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. "This is illegal! I am the CEO!" Richard screamed, his composed facade entirely shattered. "Not anymore," Rebecca said, stepping out from the shadows. She walked up to Richard, her blue eyes piercing right through his soul. "You took my legs, you took my company, but you made one fatal mistake, Richard. You went after his daughter." She turned away, leaving Richard to scream as the agents dragged him out of the office. Kevin walked over to the floor vent. He reached his long arm inside the metal duct, feeling around for a moment before pulling out the platinum key. He wiped the dust off it and handed it to Rebecca. "I believe this is yours, Ms. CEO." Kevin smiled, his face smeared with soot and blood, looking more handsome to her than any billionaire ever could. Rebecca took the key, but she didn't look at it. She dropped it into her pocket, stepped forward, and wrapped her arms around Kevin's neck, pulling him into a fierce, passionate kiss. Kevin froze for a second, then dropped his hammer, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, lifting her off the ground as the storm raged outside. 2 days later, the sun was shining brightly through the windows of the pediatric recovery ward at Chicago Presbyterian Hospital. Emma was sitting up in bed, a massive stuffed bear sitting next to her, a faint but healthy color returning to her cheeks. Her heart surgery had been a complete success. Kevin sat in a chair beside the bed, holding his daughter's hand, a profound peace settling over him for the first time in 3 years. The heavy weight of debt, fear, and desperation was completely gone. The door opened softly, and Rebecca walked in. She was wearing a beautiful, simple sundress, no power suits, no threadbare disguises, just Rebecca. "Look, Daddy, Vicky is here!" Emma cheered. Rebecca smiled, walking over and kissing Emma's forehead. "Hi, sweetie. You're looking so strong today." She handed Kevin a manila folder. "What's this?" Kevin asked. "I had my lawyers finalize the paperwork this morning," Rebecca said, her eyes shining. "Caldwell International is no longer in the real estate business. We dissolved Apex Holdings, but before we did, I transferred the deed to the commercial warehouse on 5th Street. It's fully zoned for industrial woodworking." Kevin opened the folder, staring at the deed to a massive workshop, fully paid for, in his name. "Rebecca, I told you. I can't take your charity." It's not charity." "Kevin," Rebecca said softly, sitting on the edge of his chair, resting her hand on his shoulder. "It's an investment. I want a 10% stake in Hayes Custom Furniture, and I expect a return. You're a master carpenter, Kevin. It's time you started building your own empire." Kevin looked at the deed, then up at the woman who had turned his world upside down, broken it apart, and helped him put it back together into something beautiful. "A deal," Kevin whispered, pulling her in for a kiss. Rebecca had gone looking for the worst in humanity, disguised in a broken wheelchair. But in the mud and the rain, she hadn't just found a good man. She had found her family. Sometimes the greatest fortunes aren't kept in bank vaults, but in the calloused hands of a father willing to sacrifice everything for his child. Rebecca hid her wealth to test the world, but Kevin's pure heart ended up saving her life, her company, and his daughter's future. True wealth is finding someone who loves you when you have absolutely nothing. If this story of betrayal, sacrifice, and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that good people still exist. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more heart-pounding, real-life drama stories. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Kevin's shoes?